Here's a little thought experiment for you. Say we're standing next to one of the many massive forest fires that are happening more and more around the world today, and this one appears to be burning uncontrollably. A group of technologists has arrived with a host of water-carrying drones designed to extinguish the flames. The drones are helping a bit, but they're not really putting the fire out. Don't worry, say the technologists, we're developing a variety of much bigger drones that will do a much better job. But you'll all need to be patient, they tell us, because some of those machines are only at prototype stage, others haven't even left the drawing board yet, and none of them will be available soon. The fire will probably get worse while we're developing those solutions, they explain, but once they're in full production, we'll probably be able to put the fire out. Meanwhile, a 5-year-old child spots a bunch of supply lines pumping gasoline directly onto the forest floor, fueling the fire. The little girl turns to her father and says, "Daddy, why don't we just ask those men over there to switch off their pipes?" Am I being just another annoying and patronising YouTuber with this rather simplistic and patently obvious analogy? Or maybe, I'll let you be the judge of that. But in essence, the root cause of and solution to our climate predicament really isn't much more complicated than that analogy suggests. On Monday the 10th of November 2025, the 30th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate, otherwise known as COP30, kicked off in Belém in Brazil. Ahead of the meeting, COP30 President André Aranha Corrêa de Lago wrote a 10-page letter to delegates full of very fine words about historic levels of global cooperation and climate finance and new technologies and the need to innovate and adapt and preserve forests and ensure justice for the most vulnerable. All very relevant and crucial stuff, no doubt about it. But in the entire 10-page, 5,000-word document, you will not find a single mention of the words oil or gas or coal, and the phrase fossil fuels is mentioned just once, in a sentence so hopelessly ambiguous it's a wonder it was included at all. So are our global leaders properly focused on the real priority here, or are we being led by a bunch of busy fools? Hello, and welcome to Just Have a Think. There's always a furious flurry of PR activity running up to the annual COP conferences, isn't there? Think tanks publish reports with data on everything from falling renewable technology costs to the most recent atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and environmentalists post op-eds and articles planting their own rhetorical stake firmly in the ground. One of the most common assertions we've been hearing in the run-up to COP30 from political leaders like Senor Corrêa de Lago and techno-optimists like Bill Gates is that we should all be patting ourselves on the back for how well we've done since the historic Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015. Significant collective progress towards the Paris Agreement temperature goal has been made, says the COP president in his letter. From an expected global temperature increase over 4 degrees Celsius, according to some projections prior to the adoption of the agreement, to an increase in the range of 2.1 to 2.8 degrees Celsius with the full implementation of the current nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Climate change is serious, but we've made great progress, says Bill Gates in the first sentence of his recent 17-page essay. There's a doomsday view of climate change that goes like this, he says. In a few decades, cataclysmic climate change will decimate civilization. The evidence is all around us. Just look at all the heat waves and storms caused by rising global temperatures. Nothing matters more than limiting the rise in temperature. Fortunately for all of us, Bill explains reassuringly, this view is wrong. Although climate change will have serious consequences, particularly for people in the poorest countries, it will not lead to humanity's demise. So just a couple of thoughts here. Firstly, no serious climate scientist that I've been listening to since I started this channel 8 years ago has ever suggested that near-term human extinction is a likely outcome of our warming climate. And there's some clever wordsmithing going on here by Mr. Gates, isn't there? It will not lead to humanity's demise, he says. But of course there's a massive sliding scale between everything is fine, nothing to worry about at one end of the scale, and oh dear, every single member of the 8 billion strong human species has disappeared. Along that sliding scale, we will likely see a whole spectrum of chaos before we ever get close to extinction, like coastal cities flooding with millions displaced by rising seas, once fertile farmland turning to dust under relentless heat waves, mass migrations and border tensions as people move simply to survive, resource wars over water and food in regions already on the brink, spikes in food and energy prices that push fragile economies into collapse, and political extremism feeding off the anger and fear that follow. None of that spells the end of humanity, but it almost certainly spells the end of stability as we've known it. Secondly, no serious climate scientist that I'm aware of is basing any of their climate projections on simply looking out of the window at what's happening today, as Bill Gates infers. Those projections are based on meticulous fieldwork by thousands of research scientists all over the planet, including extensive paleoclimatological analysis and extremely sophisticated climate modelling that can be very accurately validated by running the models backwards to see if they match what actually happened in the past. Bill knows that perfectly well, of course, because he's not an idiot, is he? But let's leave Bill's little missive to one side for now and have a closer look at those numbers that Senor Corrêa de Lago quoted in his letter to the COP30 delegates. Saying the world has gone from 4 degrees of projected warming to somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees is a bit like saying we've reduced our nuclear arsenal from 40,000 warheads to only 20,000. I mean, it's definitely a reduction, but it's not an overwhelmingly comforting one, is it? And it's worth drilling down into those temperature projections a little bit further using the United Nations' own data. Back in 2015, just prior to the COP21 Paris Climate Conference, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its so-called Fifth Assessment Report, or AR5, and in that report they showed us this chart of various emission scenarios, or as they call them, represented concentration pathways, or RCPs. Those RCPs corresponded to predicted rises in annual greenhouse gas emissions, shown on the left-hand vertical axis as measured in gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. RCP 8.5 was sort of a notional worst-case scenario that assumed extremely rapid growth in coal use, high population growth, very little technological advancement, and no new climate mitigation policies from any national government. That was really not an accurate representation of what was happening at the time. So it was generally accepted that RCP 6.0 was a better gauge of what became known as the business as usual, or BAU scenario, with CO2 equivalent emissions rising quite dramatically to 80 gigatons per year by 2080, followed by a 20-year drop back down to a measly 60 gigatons per year by the end of the century, as a bunch of as yet unproven technologies like direct air carbon capture and storage, and mass adoption of hydrogen as a fuel all kicked in at massive scale to heroically save the day. Now, an important aspect to pay attention to here is the range of possible annual emissions, represented by the purple shaded patch surrounding the black projection line. That range suggested that RCP 6.0 emissions could be as low as 43 gigatons per year, or as high as 85 gigatons per year by 2100. And this is where Senor Corrêa de Lago gets his 4 degrees Celsius number from. The likely RCP 6.0 projected temperature range was between 2.1 and 5.8 degrees Celsius. Fast forward to today, and we can use the latest emissions gap report from the United Nations Environment Programme, or UNEP, to see if we can find Senor Corrêa de Lago's quoted projection of 2.1 to 2.8 degrees Celsius for our current situation. And sure enough, there it is in this chart on page 21 of the report, in the first column called Current Policies Continuing, 2.8 degrees loud and proud in the especially big circle in the middle. But we've got those pesky range lines again, haven't we? They tell us that our current range is actually between 2.1 and 3.9 degrees Celsius of warming. And hang on a minute, because the colour key just above the chart informs us that there's only a 66% chance that we'll stay below that number. So it's by no means a given. And even though there's a 90% chance we'll stay below the green line, if all current policies are strictly adhered to, that still leaves a 10% chance we won't. And the range on that line goes from 2.5 to 4.6 degrees Celsius. Scientists are now finding that the global climate appears to be responding to anthropogenic forcing far more rapidly than previously thought, so that's likely to be nudging us up towards the higher end of those projection ranges. And what do you reckon the likelihood is of all nations sticking to those current policies in today's geopolitical environment? In April 2024, a Berlin-based non-profit climate science and policy institute called Climate Analytics found that none of the G7 members are on track to meet their existing emission reduction targets for 2030, which are not yet collectively aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius. Under current policies, the G7 are set to reduce emissions by 19 to 33% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. This is at best half of what is needed, which we estimate to be reductions of at least 58% over the same time period. 2025 is supposed to be a global stocktake year when all countries are meant to submit new, strengthened, nationally determined contribution or NDC plans to the United Nations. By the end of October 2025, in the run-up to the COP30 meeting, only 64 out of 195 countries had done so. In that same month, the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, informed us that between 2023 and 2024, the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide exhibited the largest increase since measurements began back in 1957, reaching 424 parts per million. The consequences of all these things were assessed very recently by the Financial Times, hardly a bastion of radical environmental activism, eh? But their October article provides us with the chart showing the record CO2 concentrations, and then it shows us that we've already gone past one of our Earth system tipping points as our coral reefs suffer mass die-offs, and that we're about to sail past another 5. That doesn't mean the West Antarctic ice sheet or AMOC or the Amazon rainforest are all suddenly going to collapse and disappear tomorrow, or even this year or this decade, or perhaps not even this century. But it does mean those processes have now been triggered, and once the tipping point is reached, there's no going back. And then there's the Lancet, another publication not known for its hysterical, unqualified hyperbole. In fact, it's about as cautious and conservative a journal as you're likely to find. But its 2025 countdown report tells us that the health threats of climate change have reached concerning unprecedented levels, and that delays in taking climate change action are resulting in millions of avoidable deaths every year. The Lancet points out that, in addition to the impacts of climate change, the failure to transition to clean energy sources also led to 2.5 million deaths from fossil fuel-derived outdoor air pollution in 2022, and 2.3 million deaths from household air pollution derived from the persistent use of dirty fuels and technologies inside people's homes. And the report goes on to explain that, in response to soaring fossil fuel prices, governments around the world turned to costly subsidies to keep energy affordable. This generated a global net fossil fuel subsidy of almost $1 trillion in 2023, using funds that governments could have alternatively allocated towards activities that benefit rather than harm local health and well-being. 15 countries even allocated more funds to net fossil fuel subsidies than to their national health budgets. So, contrary to Bill Gates' assertion in his recent 5,500-word essay that there is simply not enough money to address immediate health threats and invest heavily in climate change mitigation all at the same time, in fact there's plenty of money slopping around. It's just being controlled by the wrong people. And those people are predominantly linked to the fossil fuel industry. Just look how private banks switched from green loans to fossil fuel loans as soon as Donald Trump won the 2024 US presidential election. Even Gates himself, via the Gates Foundation, has, according to the investigative website DeSmog, donated $3.5 million in recent years to a think tank run by a man called Bjorn Lomborg, who the DeSmog team describe as a climate crisis denier. For many years, Lomborg has been arguing in op-eds and lectures and broadcast media that there are more important global issues to prioritise than climate change, writing in April that it is not the existential threat that some would have us believe, echoing precisely the words that Bill Gates used in his recent essay. So as we watch our noble leaders at the COP30 climate conference in Belém, or at least the ones who could be bothered to turn up anyway, discuss many of the perfectly legitimate and extremely important questions of global cooperation, climate adaptation, halting deforestation, protecting ecosystems, and improving the health and prosperity of the world's most vulnerable people, we could be forgiven for thinking that the goal of the mighty fossil fuel lobbyists to distract, delay, obfuscate and confuse the messaging around the need for an urgent and rapid reduction in the combustion of coal, oil and methane gas has been very successfully achieved. And at least while the global political direction is currently being manoeuvred and manipulated by a grossly ignorant and ill-informed man full of nostalgia for the good old days of post-war American prosperity and dominance, perhaps there is some justification for the high levels of cynicism that now surround the United Nations COP process. But let's face it, our modern capitalist world is ultimately driven more by market forces than it is by politicians, isn't it? And in that system, the best product at the lowest price will always be the winner in any marketplace. And if you strip away all subsidies from all energy production, it becomes clear that renewables like solar and wind, backed up with energy storage in technologies like pumped hydro and batteries, are now winning the race against fossil fuels in almost every part of the world. So I'll leave the last word to the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, speaking at a meeting of COP30 leaders on the Friday before the conference started.
So let me finish by noting that COP30 must send a clear message that the green transition is here to stay and that fossil fuels have no future.
Now, I imagine there'll be some strident views on this subject, there usually are, so if you're harbouring a burning desire to express your opinion, then as always, the place to leave your thoughts is in the comment section below. That's it for this week though. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and you can also directly help keep the lights on around here by joining the heroic group of channel supporters over at patreon.com/justhavathink. And I must just give an extra special thank you to the folks whose names are scrolling up the screen beside me here, all of whom celebrate an anniversary of Patreon support in November. Most important of all though, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.